So it's a great pleasure for Temblor to host Mario Aurelio on our webinar series. And I'm also pleased that Sandra Catugas, one of his graduate students, is also here to co-host this. Now, Dr. Aurelio is a professor at the University of the Philippines, and he teaches at their National Institute of Geological Science and heads their Structural Geology and Tectonics lab. Mario was also an elected member of the Commission on the International Seabed Authority, an autonomous UN agency that has a crucial role to play in guarding our seabed resources and using them responsibly. Mario is a recipient of the Achievement Award of the National Research Council of the Philippines. He received the Outstanding Young Scientist Award by the National Academy of Science and Technology, and the Professional of the Year for Geology Award by the Professional Regulation Commission. And he also received the Gregorio Zara Award for Basic Science Research by the Philippine Association of the Advancement of Science and Technology. And in 2022, Asian Science magazine named him as one of the 100 leading scientists in Asia. Now, closer to home, Mario has also authored 9 Temblor Earth News articles, the most recent of which was read by 30,000 people. And so now let's hear from Mario.
Thank you very much, Ross, for that very kind introduction. I hope I will live up to it. And thank you for Temblor for the invitation to speak in this webinar, which has an international audience. Today, good day, everyone. Today, I would like, together with my co-author, Sandra Catugas, to share the results of some of our work as far as earthquakes in the Philippines are concerned, and focus my discussion on efforts to advance our understanding of this severe seismic threat in the Philippines. In my first slide, you will see a set of photographs showing the degree of damage, infrastructure damage during earthquakes in the Philippines. In the last 11 years, there have been at least 13, maybe perhaps I've even not included the others, but there were at least 13 devastating earthquakes. So that's more than one devastating earthquake per year. And they have happened all throughout the Philippines, from Luzon, the main island in the north, in the Visayas, in the central Philippines, and to the south in Mindanao. The location of the photographs that you are seeing here are indicated on the map in numbers. There are 13 of them. Perhaps one of the areas where earthquakes are not very common, but they do exist also in the northern part, is the island called Palawan. And there's a reason behind that. Now, the type of damage, infrastructure damage, vary from place to place, but usually you would see collapsed bridges like photographs 1 and 3, or collapsed residential houses like photographs 7 and 10 and 11 in Abra, and also commercial establishments as well as government offices in certain areas. Some earthquakes produce what we call a ground rupture. That means a crack on the ground because the energy still strong enough when it reaches the surface and can rupture the ground. Or others also are tsunamigenic, meaning they can cause tsunami, just like the recent one in 2003 in Cotabato. Now, the reason why the Philippines is earthquake prone, of course, this is obvious to many Filipino geologists, but to those who are not familiar with the Philippines is surrounded by at least 6 subduction zones, 2 on the east, the East Luzon Trough in the Philippine Trench, and 4 on the west, the Manila Trench, the Negros Trench, the Salute Trench, and the Cotabato Trench. And right at the middle of these 2 opposing subduction zones in direction, meaning to the east, the subduction system is dipping to the west, and to the west, the subduction system is dipping to the east. Right at the middle, in between these two subduction systems, is what we call a Philippine mobile belt. And that Philippine mobile belt is traversed by at least 200 active faults as far as the count of the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology is concerned. But there could be more because there are some earthquakes in the past that have been caused by faults that have not been mapped before those earthquakes occurred. And the presence of these active faults is mainly due to the very dynamic nature of the plates around, in and around the Philippines, because there's a Philippine Sea Plate, which is an oceanic crust, moving at a very fast rate of about 9 centimeters per year. And because of that, it pushes everything in the Philippine mobile belt to move also in a similar direction, meaning to the northwest, but at varying rates, but still very fast. As you can see, for example, the legend of the rate is indicated in the upper part of the map at the middle. Rates that can be as high as 5 to 6 centimeters per year, which is rather large for plate motion or block motion compared to in other places in the world, like for example in Turkey or in Greece or in Italy. And even in California, the San Andreas Fault is moving at a much lower rate. The result of this this very dynamic nature of plates in the Philippines, of course, is numerous earthquakes, as can be seen on this map, which shows the epicentral distribution, meaning the location of all epicenters. This is rather outdated, but a recent map would look very similar to this. You would say concentration of the earthquakes in the trenches, like in the Philippine Trench and the Manila Trench, but also inside the Philippine mobile belt, mainly because of the presence of the Philippine Fault, which runs from Luzon to Mindanao to the south for about 1,200 kilometers long. The Philippine Fault is very similar to the San Andreas Fault in California. Now, right off, for my third slide, I'd like already to make a quick summary of what I'm going to present in the next slides. And I will divide my discussion into rather 4 categories of earthquakes. And those categories are divided as a function of the nature of the earthquakes occurring in different places. So one of them would be those which are related to the Philippine Fault. As I mentioned earlier, the Philippine Fault runs from the northern tip of the Philippines in Luzon to the southern tip in Mindanao for about 1,200 kilometers. And it is moving in a left lateral sense, what we call a left lateral sense, meaning a fault where the block in front of you across the fault moves to the left. The San Andreas Fault moves in the opposite sense. It moves in the right lateral sense. The second set of faults of earthquakes will be those which were associated with the Cotabato earthquake in 2019. I'd like to discuss this because it is quite interesting and very, shall I say, very rare, because there were 4 earthquakes with magnitude 6 and greater happening only within a period of 2 weeks. The third type of earthquakes will be those related to subduction systems, but not only because they are in the subduction zones, but because they are happening close to volcanic arcs. Some of them are arcs including active volcanoes, and there in several of the earthquakes that happened in the past, we recognize the possible link between the association between an earthquake and volcanic activity several years later. And finally, the fourth type of earthquakes will be those which occurred in areas where there have been no active faults mapped earlier before those earthquakes occurred. And those places are in the Visayas, in Bohol, Negros, and Zambales in the north. So what I will do next is to just move around the Philippines. We'll start with the earthquake in Abra in 2022. That's July 27th of July. There was a rather large earthquake, magnitude 7.2, and a very shallow one, meaning the focal depth is very shallow at 15 kilometers. That's why the damage was quite significant, including damage on, again, century-old church here. And as you can see, for example, this house here, in the photograph, what you see now as the first floor is actually the second floor, meaning the ground floor has been completely just completely collapsed. And you can see here a vehicle which was pinched by the collapse of the second floor. Later on in October, less than 3 months after the 7.2 earthquake, there was another earthquake of a rather large magnitude also, 6.4, not too far away from the previous earthquake, only about 16 aerial kilometers distance, and also inflicted similar degree of damage in the vicinity, infrastructure damage. We took a look at, for the first earthquake, we took a look at what could have produced the earthquake. For the non-geologists here or non-scientists here, structural geologists, including Professor Ross Stein here, are sometimes maligned as fault finders, because the first thing we would like to do when an earthquake happens is to look for the fault that caused the earthquake. And so we are fault finders. I'm showing now a map on the right-hand side of the screen, and a section and a block diagram all in one figure. But what these figures would like to show is the behavior of the earthquake, as well as the stresses that were released after the earthquake. Now, we are looking at a map with colors. The colors indicate what we call the column stress, behavior of the column stress that were transferred. And they are produced by a software, through a software that was developed by Professor Ross Stein together with his colleagues, Shinji Toda of Tohoku University, and Volkan Selvigen. I'm not sure if Volkan is in the room right now. So they have developed this to try to understand how stresses transfer after an earthquake occurs and where do they go. So in a map like this, for example, you see two colors, mainly the blue and the red ones. The blue colors are those areas where after an earthquake, stress is released, meaning they escape that area, but they do not escape to the atmosphere. They move to other places, still in the lithosphere, in the crust, and they go to the red places, to the red colors. So what do we see here in the case of the Abra earthquake, magnitude 7.2? It appears that the main shock, which is shown by the biggest, what we call beach balls, we don't have much time, of course, to discuss what this means, but just take a look at their location, their position for now. What this means is that after the main shock, you see the surrounding areas are color blue. So stresses left those areas, but they moved to these areas here. Now, the second thing is that the Philippine fault, if it was immediately almost after the earthquake in July, many believe that it was caused by the Philippine fault because that's the known structure there. But the Philippine fault is the understanding of many of the Philippine fault that it is a structural fault and it's a vertical fault, meaning the plane is vertical, and when it moves, it produces an earthquake. Now, when we took a look at the distribution of the earthquakes, including the main shock and the aftershocks, we noted that we are now looking here at a cross-section, meaning a slice through the earth, vertical slice through the earth. The distribution of the earthquakes, the main shock and the aftershocks, don't seem to follow a vertical plane, but instead they coincide with a plane which is inclined to the east, to the right is the east, at a rather shallow angle, about 35 to 40 degrees. And so then it was contradictory to the earlier belief that it was caused by the vertical plane of the Philippine fault. Now, the Philippine fault, however, in that area has several branches, and it is perhaps one of those branches which caused the Philippine fault, not the main branch, which is called the Abra River Fault. We modeled the geometry of the plane, like so, meaning there's a section where it is dipping more gently than the upper part of the plane, which is less gentle or steeper. Now, we know a little, we know quite, we have a good understanding of the geology of the area. I actually bring my students in that area every year. And we know that the Philippine Fault there has a what we call a flower structure, meaning there's a main branch which is vertical right here, that but has several branches, and one of them goes to the west in a rather low inclination, and we call that the Vegan Agao Fault. So in the Temblor article that we submitted, that was published, we suggested that perhaps it was the Vegan Agaw fault that generated the earthquake, not the Abra River fault, which is the vertical fault. Now, as I mentioned a while ago, less than 3 months later, another earthquake took place. And there's just one thing I'd like to mention here. You know, this is the first earthquake magnitude 7. The second earthquake magnitude 4 occurred right on the boundary between a blue and a red color. But if you take on the map, but if you take a look at the slice of the same area, then you'd see that the second earthquake actually occurred on the red colors on the vertical plane. So what this might imply is that the first earthquake magnitude 7 might have triggered the second earthquake of magnitude 6.4 because it occurred in an area where stresses have accumulated after the first big event of magnitude 7. So we thought of modeling the fault that produced the two earthquakes. We think that it's the same fault, but it's a branch of the Philippine Fault. It's the same fault, but on a map, they exist. They have two different names. One is the Viganagaw Fault, which runs through like this. That's the more westerly branch. And then it goes into what is called locally as the South Solsona Fault, turning to the northeast. And therefore, we see what we modeled here is not a very simple plane, a straight plane, like so, but instead a curving plane. And so the takeaway here perhaps is that these earthquakes are as complex as their geometries, so that when earthquakes, it is very difficult to predict or to forecast where the next earthquake could occur because of the very complex geometry of the faults themselves that are causing the earthquakes. Okay, that's for Abra. Now let me turn the page to another area, but still along the Philippine Fault in the central Visayas, or actually southern Luzon, southeast of Abra. You are looking here at the map to on the upper left-hand side of the screen. By the way, I'll retain that map almost all throughout the presentation. Is a location map of the earthquake. So the dots will be moving from north to south and back again to the north. You can see here in my view graph a very interesting pair of photographs. They were taken exactly in the same place, but in different times. To the left was taken in February of 2003. This is care of Fivolks. And to the right is photograph taken in 2020. So these photographs are 17 years apart, 17 years apart. But what do you notice? They have many similarities, but also differences. One similarity is that you see a coconut tree being split into two because of the rupturing of a fault. So this fault is very wise, very clever, that it was able to find the coconut tree to split it into two. It could have been somewhere else. The rupture could have been somewhere else, but it chose to rupture the coconut tree. Perhaps there was a reason behind that, because 17 years later, that same fault ruptured again the same tree. And at very, shall we say, to the accuracy of a few centimeters, tens of centimeters only. And what happened, therefore, to the coconut tree, in 2003, it became a two-legged coconut tree. And in 2020, it became a three-legged coconut tree. Now, this phenomenon is quite rare. Personally, I've not seen a similar scenario whereby a tree was ruptured twice by the same fault only within a period of 17 years. So a student of mine who just finished his master's, and I think he is in the room. I saw him a while ago while reviewing the participants. Deo Liamas, you might want to wave Deo virtually. Um, and he took a look at many aspects of the earthquake. There you go, the handout, Deo. Congratulations, Deo. He took a look at many aspects of those two earthquakes and decided, well, one of his conclusions, there are many figures on this view graph, but I'll just go right ahead on the lower right hand the figure, which summarizes the conclusion of Deo. He thinks that the reason why the fault there in Masbate has been rupturing quite in close intervals, we call it return period, meaning the same fault moving in almost at the same segment in very close intervals of time. He thinks that the reason why there is a frequent movement of that fault there is that there might be asperities along the fault plane, and that in those asperities, every now and then they would accumulate stress. And when the ability of the fault to hold or to resist those stresses is exceeded, then the fault moves and produces the earthquakes again. If there will be questions about this, Deo is in the room, so you might want to ask him. Okay, so the takeaway here is that short return periods might be expected in areas where there are overlaps in fault activity, and which might be related to what earthquake geologists as asperities. Asperities are simply irregularities on the fault plane, and there are many types of this. In fact, on the last example I'll show later, we may also consider that as an asperity. Let's move not too far away from Masbate in an island called Leyte. Leyte is an island which is both traversed by the Philippine Fault, but also it is a volcanic island. It has two active volcanoes, one in the north and another in the south. And right at the middle, there's an inactive volcanic chain, plenty of volcanic cones, and it is being harnessed for geothermal energy. To date, it is by far producing the largest it has the largest capacity in terms of production for geothermal resources. In 2017, there were 3 earthquakes within a period of 4 days, and with very shallow focal depths. The first earthquake with magnitude 6.5 actually produced a ground rupture, and you see here in this photograph, these are all, by the way, thanks to PHIVOLCS. They are in the website of PHIVOLCS. These are our colleagues from PHIVOLCS. Some of them were my former students. The is in there. Produced a ground rupture showing a left lateral displacement, which is very consistent with our knowledge of the displacement of the Philippine Fault. But what is interesting in that sequence of earthquakes, 3 earthquakes with magnitudes between 5.9 and 6.5, is that, again, if you take a look at column stress maps, you can easily see the relationship, the triggering relationship between the first earthquake and the next 2 earthquakes, as shown by this CST or column stress transfer map, as well as in the section. The main shock is in the big star on the blue area, which means that stresses were released, and the 2 other earthquakes occurred in the red areas, which means that there could have been triggering. Now, Yang et al., a colleague from, I think I also saw him in the room, registered a while ago, took a look at the slip behavior of the fault during that sequence of earthquakes. And well, of course, you can check out the article, but in one of the conclusions, these authors, myself included actually in the article, believe that there were sections of the fault that did not slip. what we call sleep deficit, meaning something in the entire fault plane which was expected to move. We are looking here at the cross section again, and you see colors and arrows on that plane, but there's an area SD-1 where there are no colors and there are no arrows, which indicate that in this area the fault did not move, did not rupture, did not slip, according to the model, of course. So this could be in the future, in the future, a possible area of movement of the fault, and therefore there could be an earthquake in the future along within that area. Now, one thing I'd like the audience to observe is that this fault passes right through a volcanic edifice called Mount Bao. It's the largest volcanic edifice. It is inactive, at least as per the list of faults, but it is right underneath, the fault is right underneath the volcano. And I do not have here a material, but there was a French author, Roman Priul, I'm not sure if he's here, maybe some of his colleagues are here, thought or conducted some experiments by by making use of some of the existing drill wells in the geothermal field, and looked at the behavior of the fault when there's geothermal fluid circulating. And in one of the conclusions of that paper was that the high frequency of earthquakes in Leyte might be explained because of the presence of geothermal fluids, which are sort of lubricating the fault. But fortunately, it is quite fortunate that there's lubricating fluids, because the magnitudes of the earthquakes are not that large because they are frequently moving. However, the sleep deficit, which was modeled by Yang et al., might be the site of the next earthquake in the future. Okay, so let me go back. So that was in Leyte. Let me go back to Luzon, this time in a place called Batangas. It's not too far away from Manila. It's only about 60 to 70 aerial kilometers distance. In Batangas, there was a sequence of earthquakes, five earthquakes within a period of 4 days, with magnitudes between 4.9 and 5.9. Well, some might say these are not large magnitudes, but the main shock, which is of magnitude 5.9, was very shallow at 6 kilometers. And in fact, it also inflicted damage on infrastructure, like what you can observe in these photographs shown here. The Taal Cathedral, also I think 3 centuries old church in Taal, was damaged with some of its pillars broken. But scientifically, the location of the earthquakes are, as shown on the map here, are located on the southwestern tip of the Batangas Peninsula. And if you look at their position, there is no known active fault that could have produced those 5 earthquakes in that area, because this fault set of faults, the VPF, which is Verde Passage Fault, and LF Lubang Fault, do not coincide with the location, at least, of the 5 earthquakes. So we took a look at the distribution of the earthquakes and recognized that, because the other alternative was that these earthquakes could have been generated by the trench, the Manila Trench. But the Manila Trench involves the subduction of the South China Sea, the oceanic slab of the South China Sea, in a quite vertical plane going underneath, and located right about here. The Benue zone, or the location of the earthquakes expected of subduction, would be here. But then the Mabini earthquakes, Mabini is the local name of the place in Batangas, occurred do not lie on the expected location of subduction related earthquakes. So another student of mine, I think he also registered, finished a thesis and included in his thesis the discussion on what could be the source of the earthquakes of Batangas in April of 2017, 5 of them, but cannot be explained by the presence of the Verde Passage Fault or the Lubang Fault. Now, in 2020, in the same place, in the same Batangas province, Taal volcano erupted. January 12 was the main eruption, but it continued on several days later. I'm showing here now an animation or plot of the earthquakes that were related to the volcanic eruption during, before and during and even after volcanic activity. There are earthquakes which are produced because of the rise of the magma. They are called volcanic quakes as opposed to tectonic earthquakes. But you can see in the time-lapse animations, the distribution of the earthquake epicenters shown on the map, as well as the hypocenters shown on the cross sections, which are crossing almost perpendicularly to each other. And what you notice is a preference in the distribution of the earthquakes oriented northeast, southwest. They are not concentrated right at the middle of the volcano, which is here, which logically would be their location, meaning in and around that volcano right there. But instead, the earthquakes tended to orient themselves in a northeast, southwest direction and off axis of the volcano, not right on the volcano. The Taal volcano is the small island there. There's a lake inside it, and the Taal volcano is within a lake. That's why this is the volcano where you have a lake inside an island, inside a lake, inside an island. Now, a colleague of ours, Grace Bato, and I think she's also in the room, who now works, by the way, at JPL in NASA in California also, wrote a paper together with her colleagues making use of INSAR interferometry analysis and combined it with seismicity data. And in one of their conclusions, I think their main conclusion, that the eruption of 2020 was caused by the rise of a dike. Dike, meaning a dike is something which is tabular in form, elongated in one direction, in two directions, but thin or rather narrow on the other dimension. Why is it interesting to see a volcano erupting with the dike rising? Normally, what many would think, especially to the non-scientists, is that magma would be rising from a magma chamber, which is rather spherical, and then coming out of a pipe-like channelway, but not a dike. But in the case of the Taal volcano eruption in 2020, the model presented by Grace Bato et al. Was that it was a dike. Now, why is it also interesting to try to analyze why the shape of the rising magma? Because when we went back to our model in 2017, of course, in 2017 we were already sort of thinking about the possible effects of the stresses that transferred from the 2017 earthquake. But when we went back to our model in 2017, we noticed that in our column model, the Mabini earthquakes actually caused the transfer of stresses from Mabini, which is to the south of Taal volcano, towards the volcano, as can be shown on the map here with the red colors going towards Taal volcano, both in the map and in cross section. So there might be a possibility of a relationship link, maybe not the full cause of the eruption of Taal in 2020, but those earthquakes might have contributed in activating the magma chamber system of Taal volcano underneath, because as you can see in this section, for example, they're colored red, orange, yellow, green, which indicates increase in stress. The highest that you would see right underneath Taal would be about 0.4 bar. So the question, next question would be how much stress would you need to sort of mobilize or activate a magma system to cause a volcanic eruption? The takeaway here is that when earthquakes occur in areas close to volcanic centers, there might be a chance of causing activity on the volcanic system. Volcanic activity does not necessarily mean an eruption. Could simply be an increase in the pressure, temperature conditions underneath the volcano, and thereby causing perhaps, for example, higher heat measurements when we do measurements underneath the volcano. Okay, now from Luzon, I'm shifting back to the south in a place called Cotabato. In 2019, between October 16 and October 31st, there was a series of earthquakes, 4 of them, not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4, with magnitudes greater than 6. You can see them on this map. So we are right here, almost to the southernmost tip of the Philippines. You can see here a blown up map of this area here, and the 4 beach balls again, which indicate the location. There are arrows indicating their locations here. The first one occurring on October 16 with a magnitude 6.4. And then the 3 others only within a period of 2 days, a 6.6, a 5.9, and a 6.5 between the 29th and 31st of October. You can see here the type of infrastructure damage in this building. This floor that you are looking at here is, I think, the 3rd, if not the 2nd floor of the building, which means that the ground floor at least has totally collapsed. In residential houses, this is a type of infra damage that were produced. Now, here I animate also sort of a time lapse of the epicenters of the earthquakes between the 16th and 31st of October within 20 seconds, but they occurred within 2 weeks. What you may notice is, number one, there is a preference on the orientation of the earthquakes, the main shock and aftershocks. But also, you notice if I place the cursor, the animation cursor, say right at the middle, that means after 1 week on, there's only one earthquake there. That's October 6 in earthquake magnitude 6.3. But then there were 4. So it means that the first earthquake, after the first earthquake, it took quite a while before the next earthquake occurred. But then once it started, the 3 earthquakes occurred in succession within 2 days. So again, this is a quite rare case, at least during the time that I'm studying earthquakes. It's quite a rare occasion that you have magnitude 6, greater than magnitude 6 earthquakes occurring within 2 days, 3 of them affecting the same area. Now, there was a paper by Chinese authors, Li et al., and again also used interferometry. And of course, there are long discussions of how they came about their conclusions, but in one of their conclusions, they suggested that the reason why there were 4 big earthquakes in a short span of time within a very constrained area is that in that area, there is a set of faults we call conjugate faults which are crisscrossing each other, but operating almost at the same time, mechanically speaking. And so when there are enough stresses in that area, then not only 1 or 2 of those faults may be activated, but all the present within the conjugate set. So their conclusion is that the first earthquake was caused by this fault, for example, the next earthquake by that fault, and the third earthquake by this other fault here, and the fourth earthquake by this fault. But all of these four faults belong to a single set. We call it conjugate set. Might be similar to the explanation for the ridge crest earthquakes in recent years, but in the ridge crest earthquakes, the orientation of the faults are more orthogonal or perpendicular to each other. Here you have acute angle between two faults and the other pair of faults.
Nevertheless, very similar.
Nevertheless, very similar. Yes, yes. Okay, so the takeaway perhaps in this earthquake is that when there are in areas where there are conjugate faults, or even at the end of big faults like the Philippine fault, it bifurcates or it branches out to several segments we call a horse tail, just like the tail of a horse. Then you might expect not one, not two, but several earthquakes at a time, meaning in a very short period of time in a close constrained area, which of course can enhance or strengthen or inflict more damage because of the succession of the earthquakes. We have to remember that the effect of earthquakes is cumulative, meaning the first already can cause structural damage to a building. It might not collapse yet, but if it is followed by an earthquake very close in time and space, in the same area, then that already weakened structure can eventually collapse, like what happened in Turkey after the magnitude 7 earthquakes also recently. Now, the other, I think, point of concern in Cotabato is that the four earthquakes occurred in an area very close to Mount Apo. Mount Apo is the tallest mountain in the Philippines, about 3,000 meters, almost 3,000 meters in height. And Mount Apo is also a volcano. It is inactive though. But if you take a look at the column model, at least for the two earthquakes, we would notice that there, after 2019, stresses have been accumulating underneath Mount Apo. We have shared this with colleagues at a geothermal company, because this is also a geothermal site being developed by one of the geothermal companies in the Philippines. And we have discussed this also with our colleagues, several of them my former students also. And they are taking sort of precautions on possible activity on the volcano. Not again, I have to clarify, make this clear that when I say volcanic activity, it does not necessarily have to be an eruption. Could be simply, strengthening or increase in, let's say, sulfatara activity around the volcano, like so. So the takeaway here is very similar to the Batangas earthquakes, that when earthquakes occur in an area which is close to a volcano, then there might be a chance for that volcano to start acting up. Now, the final area I'd like to discuss is in an area we call Surigao, that's in Mindanao also, Surigao del Sur, because only before Christmas last year, there was a magnitude 7.4. This preceded the earthquake of Japan, Western Japan actually, which had a higher magnitude. But in the Surigao earthquake, the magnitude was rather large, magnitude 7.4. And the figure you are looking at on top of the screen is some sort of a time lapse of the series of earthquakes. And you can count about 25 earthquakes with magnitudes greater than 5 from the main shock of 7.4 within 24 hours. So 25 magnitude 5 or greater earthquakes within 24 hours. Imagine the damage it could have done if the earthquake happened on land. So quite fortunately for this earthquake, the epicenter was located offshore, but still there was damage. There was infrastructure damage in Surigao del Sur and nearby provinces. Now, in this earthquake, the obvious, perhaps, culprit would be the Philippine Trench, because it is well known that there's a Philippine Trench there. But then again, why in that particular segment of the trench? Why not here? Why not there to the south? And why very shallow also, as you can see on the cross section on the right hand part of the screen. Because a subduction earthquake would normally, like in the Manila Trench earthquakes, would normally go a little deeper into the subducting slab, like say beyond 30 kilometers or even 50 kilometers in depth. But in this case, the cluster of earthquakes occurred at very shallow depths. The main shock actually was only at about 20 or less than 20 kilometers in depth, 18 kilometers in focal depth. And many of them even going as shallow as 5 kilometers or even shallower. So we sort of looking at in more detail what could have been the reason why there were shallow focal depths as well as where there were so many earthquakes, and found out that in that segment of the Philippine Trench, there appears to be an irregularity again of the seabed, which in bigger maps we would call the Mindanao Fracture Zone. Now, what is a fracture zone? There's a paper by Miller and Landgrave in 2012 uh, saying, well, the title of the paper itself is The Link Between Great Earthquakes and the Subduction of Oceanic Fracture Zones. So what are fracture zones? These are the long, very long scars of the ocean crust. One of the biggest would be found in the Pacific, for example. I think this is the Clarion fracture zone, if not the Clipperton fracture zone, just south of Hawaii. But fracture zones are, as I said, scars on the oceanic crust, but they play a very important role in the dynamism of the opening of the oceanic basins. So we don't have time to discuss the details, but the key word here is that it's an irregularity in the seabed. So that when that oceanic crust subducts, then it's provides or it serves as some sort of an asperity, a hindrance into the subduction zone, so that subduction does not occur very smoothly, and because it is not smooth, then stresses tend to build up more uh, largely or heavily in that area, and when the stresses are released, they cause big earthquakes. In the Philippines, that's the Mindanao Fracture Zone as identified by Taylor and Goodleaf in 2004. But in other parts of the Philippines, we might find other irregularities, not fracture zones, but for example, east of Luzon, there's the Benham Rise, which is a large igneous province, which may also serve as an asperity and therefore cause the accumulation of higher accumulation of stresses there. And to the west, in the Manila Trench, there's the volcanic chain, and the more infamous of them is the Scarborough Shoals. These are old volcanoes resulting from the spreading of the South China Sea some 16 to 32 million years ago. So in these areas, it's possible that large earthquakes are waiting to happen because of the inability of the trench to allow the crust to subduct smoothly, and thereby might be now accumulating large amounts of stress. So great earthquakes along subducted fracture zones, or ancient spreading centers, or even large igneous provinces. So let me go back to my third slide at the start of the presentation and summarize in the form of this map again, which you already saw earlier. For the Philippine fault earthquakes, the complexity, one takeaway is the complexity of the geometry of faults tend to also make the nature of the earthquakes more complex, meaning they can occur in quite close distances and relatively short periods of time in between, like the one in Abra and in Masbate. But also in Leyte, the takeaway there is that there's geothermal fluid circulating and might be lubricating the fault there, causing a very high frequency of earthquakes there. But second, in the most recent earthquake, there seems to be a slip deficit. And in that sleep deficit zone, the next earthquake might be waiting to happen there. In the Cotabato earthquakes, the lesson we get there is that when there are conjugate faults or sets of faults that are acting, that are mechanically operating together, if stresses build up in those areas, then all of them or most of them might be activated and therefore produce several earthquakes, not only one, not two, but several earthquakes. It could also happen along the branches of, at the end of major faults, what we call horsetail branches, like in the case of the Cotabato Fault or even in the Philippine Fault to the north and to the south. Now, in the subduction-related earthquakes, I did not discuss anymore the usual, meaning the oceanic crust subducting underneath a volcanic arc produces earthquakes. But the point I'd like to highlight here is that if earthquakes in a subduction system or close by it occur nearby volcanoes, whether they are active or inactive, then there might be a chance that the stresses that transfer from the subduction events might be tending to increase the pressure temperature conditions underneath those volcanoes and might promote activity on those volcanoes, like what might have happened in Taal and what might be waiting to happen in Mount Apo. In the fourth set category of faults, I did not have any example of it because these are rather the earlier faults, 2012 and 2013, 2012 in Negros and Bohol in 2013 and in Zambales in 2019. But we produced three papers out of the Negros and Bohol faults, and I think my co-authors, the main authors, are also in the room. My former students, Jeremy Rimando and Dr. Both of them now are doctors, JDD and Nala. Okay, I'd like to say the following because they've also contributed a lot. Well, Sandra is co-presenter today, but she's also co-author of many of the Temblor articles. Alec Ramirez, JDD and Nala, Abigail, Dr. Mahar Lagmay, and my niece, Samantha Cheska Aurelio. I think she's also in the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mario. And, you know, I can't help but say that I will never forget the coconut tripod tree. And I hope that you're making efforts to preserve it, because this is the kind of thing we want to make sure that doesn't die, because it's such an incredible site for all of us and children, maybe school children, to visit. I'll also never forget a lake inside an island inside a lake, and hope that someday I can visit that site.
You should come over.
Why
Yeah,
don't
as with the coconut tree, we have sort of emphasized to the lot owners, a farmer, to preserve as much as possible the tree. Yeah.
I think the overarching question I have for you is, it appears that a lot of these earthquakes are very interactive, that you're having sequences and progressive main shocks. And I think you're suggesting that this is a product of kind of the tortured tectonics of the Philippines, with opposing subduction zones, continental masses that don't want to go down the trench, and secondary faulting. But on the other hand, you have a very San Andreas-like continuous Philippine fault, and you have long continuous pieces of subduction zone. So have you looked at whether or not the Philippines actually has more progressive earthquakes than other places in the world?
Yeah. Well, again, I would associate that with a very complex tectonic setting of the Philippines. You see, for example, the trenches, they surround the Philippines, some sort of in a subduction system whereby there are two oppositely dipping subduction systems. In California, you only have one direction of the dip of subduction to the east, right? But in the Philippines, you have a subduction system that dips to the west and another subduction system that dips to the east, sandwiching the entire Philippine mobile belt. And within the Philippine mobile belt, you have plenty of faults. And foremost of them is the Philippine fault, which are not by chance there. I think it's because of the interaction of the Philippine Sea Plate and Eurasia that they have to move. All these faults have to move. And as far as the interaction between faults or among faults is concerned, as you mentioned, it appears that it is because of this complex nature of the faults, many of them close by each other, so that if one fault is triggered, one fault is or one fault moves, it is very likely to trigger another in a nearby area because there's a nearby fault.
Thank you. So we have some wonderful questions coming from the group. So let me ask one here. So in the Leyte example, you mentioned a quiet zone that could be the site of a future earthquake. Are there any minor faults in that zone? What do you know about the nature of the unruptured fault in that zone, the person is asking?
Yeah, I have several colleagues here who are very familiar with Leyte, and they might want to also come in. But let me go back to this figure so we have a point of reference. Yes, there are other faults in the area, but they all belong to the Philippine fault system. So the Philippine fault in Leyte has several branches, but in general, it is a relay zone of those branches in a transtensional sense, meaning there's a left lateral fault moving to the left location-wise, and in between you create a set of faults. And in fact, in several of the papers we've written in the late 90s, mid 90s, we associate the presence of that relay zone to the good circulation of geothermal fluids right there, because the faults tend to open up. They are tensional in nature. And so it might be actually a fortunate situation, at least for the geothermal system, because it allows a very good circulation of the fluids underneath the volcano, which can be harnessed to produce energy.
Thank you, Mario. And obviously, it's very important that geothermal production goes on and that you understand the potential for earthquakes being triggered by geothermal or earthquakes triggering some activity at the geothermal site. Another question we have coming back to the tripod coconut tree is someone asks, how do you know that each of these happens suddenly? Has this tree been under observation continuously? Is there a creep meter there? Do you know that these are both co-seismic, or could they be creeping phenomena?
Yeah, I'm tempted to call on my student, Deo Llamas, to explain more. But yeah, there were efforts, in fact, as early as after the 2003 event, which, by the way, the location of the epicenter was here. As early as that, there were already efforts to monitor that segment of the fault, meaning put in instruments like tensometers that could measure if there's possible creep or which areas are sticking. But then again, developing countries do not have the wherewithal always to do these things. But there are efforts, yes. I'm bringing several of my graduate and undergraduate students in the next few weeks, I hope, back to the coconut tree, and we'll try to analyze actually the fracture set that ruptured there, because it's not a single strand of fault that ruptured, but rather in what we call in an echelon formation. And several of only one of those an echelon faults actually split the coconut tree. So it's quite complex in a sense, although there's a narrow zone of fault there. And unfortunately, again, as I said, the efforts have not materialized yet, well, produced any concrete programs, for example, to monitor the earthquake more seriously. How I wish we had the system like in the San Andreas, segments of the San Andreas fault, for example, that continuously monitor movement to determine if the slip is co-seismic or displacements are co-seismic or interseismic or like so.
And just with picking up on your remark about the Philippines being a developing country, I think we could all be forgiven for thinking that this is a very modern approach, that between FIVOX and all of your collaborators, you've used interferometric satellite radar data, you've used seismicity data. Obviously, you're looking at Coulomb stress interaction, and you have a very sophisticated fault map. So you're using all the tools that one would like to see applied to the problem. And compared to California, things are happening at about 5 times the rate. So there's a lot more here to work with than one has in California. So they really don't have everything. You have a tremendous amount to teach us about how great transform faults and subduction zones work. Let me
Yes.
answer another question, or ask you another question that was provided by the audience. What can you say about earthquake early warning and any kind of ability to forecast the occurrence of earthquakes in the Philippines? Has that advanced in the last 20 years? Where are you?
Well, I would say that we are in the right direction, and I think our colleagues from FIVOLX might be in a better position to answer the question. But as far as the efforts of my laboratory is concerned, for example, we are going in the right direction. For example, making use of the tools that were mentioned by Ross right now. Every time there's an earthquake, whether it produces damage or not, we have the tendency now to take a look at them in more detail, making use of the different tools. Sandra is doing a thesis that will make use of INSAR interferometry for the Abra earthquakes, because there have been papers already published using interferometry, but only looking at the main shock, the main earthquake of magnitude 7. So Sandra will take a look at the 6.4 magnitude in together with the 7.0, and hopefully she will be able to work with Grace Bato of JPL NASA. And so you see here, collaboration is also very important. And I'd like to take this opportunity, by the way, that anyone in the audience who would be interested to come to the Philippines, of course, the Filipinos who are here, the invitation is already there. But for those who have not been to the Philippines, please do come and let's work together, and maybe we can further advance our knowledge about these earthquakes and go towards that direction of trying to forecast, or at least understand what may happen in the future.
That's a wonderful invitation. And the only way we learn about earthquakes is to go where they occur and benefit from them. And so this is an invitation that we all should take up. I'm also seeing questions about the societal and economic impacts of earthquakes in the country. I know this isn't your field, but can you tell us anything about what the costs of earthquakes have been in the Philippines over the last decade?
Yeah, well, I've not been able to monitor really in detail, but there is an office in the Philippines, the NDRMC, which under the Office of Civil Defense, which takes care of taking note, or writing down the details of the cost of damage. As far as I can remember, in several of the Temblor articles that we have written, for example, in one recent earthquake, they would be in the order of a few $1 million infrastructure damage for one earthquake. But I can imagine that the costs could be higher, actually, especially when these areas occur in relatively urbanized areas like in Abra. But the other type of damage that may not be easy to value, actually, are the century-old churches. How do you value a 400-year-old church when it is damaged?
Yeah.
So relative to reconstructing it, it might not be very expensive, but the value, the historical value of that heritage site, many of them are UNESCO heritage sites, cannot be I don't have any idea how to value those.
And of course, we should add that while the last 10 years has been extremely active, if we were to look at a very long period of time, the possibility that we will see a much larger earthquake, up to magnitude 9 in these subduction zones, or an earthquake of 8 or larger on the Philippine Fault is very real. So in other words, we can't even use the last decade to say this is the annual cost of earthquakes. Because big earthquakes are infrequent, but their consequences are enormous. So I think what I should do here is bring us to a close. It's been fascinating. Temblor will post the video in the next couple of days, so you'll have a chance to review some of these beautiful and detailed slides that Mario showed us. And I would just like to thank Sandra and all of the co-authors whose work we heard of, Escudero, Bato, Yang, Lamas, and of course the contribution of FIVOX in monitoring the country and building a great fault map. There's no shame in earthquakes occurring on unmapped faults. It happens in California, it happens in Japan, it happens in New Zealand. And so this is just the nature of the business, that we can't see everything we need to on the Earth's surface. Earthquakes will surprise us. So thanks again for this wonderful presentation and for everybody's attendance. And that's it for Temblor.